Hello, and thank you for joining us through another Work Through It Wednesday. I am Kristan Weisdack, CEO and founder of BehaviorWorx of Southwestern PA. And if you've ever taken any of our trainings, you'll notice the amazing Mandy Keckler is joining us as well because our Work Through It Wednesday scenario involves primitive reflex, and that has become her area of expertise lately. She is a core therapist in training to work through MNRI. It's musculoskeletal neurosensory motor reflex integration to help with those absent or unintegrated primitive reflexes. And she is just such a wealth of knowledge. So thank you for joining us, Mandy. We really, really appreciate it. So if you want to tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go through the scenario together.
Okay, well, thanks for having me here. Like Kristan said, my name's Mandy. I'm an occupational therapist and have been for almost 25 years now. And for about 20 years, I've been in pediatrics and have been very blessed to work in a variety of settings in schools, in an inpatient children's hospital, worked in outpatient, and most recently, many, many years in early intervention. And through that time and the exposure to lots of different diagnoses and children's from, as early as the NICU up through early 20s, I've really honed my skills, specifically looking a lot at sensory integration. And now, in the past few years, like Kristan said, really looking at even in a further dive of what's the foundational piece of what's going on with so many of our kids. And that is these reflexes that we'll talk about. And so, what this means in a nutshell is just looking at, the word primitive is early, is these movement patterns that develop in utero before a little one is even born. And they are used in the birth process and in infancy. They're critical for development, proper development, survival, protection. And then as the child matures and their neurology matures, their brain gets stronger and able to do more intentional movements, these patterns, these reflex patterns that were once automatic, just become a little bit more foundational. Sometimes you'll hear people say that they go away, and that's not actually true. They just become kind of quiet, if you will, and in the background, and we can all bring them up if we need them. An example, if you were to go fall down right now, your hands would come out to support you and catch you. And that's prime example of a reflex coming into play when we need it for protection and survival. Now, in early intervention and beyond, we're seeing these reflexes still present, if you will, when they should be kind of more in the background, foundational. And so what that is a clue for us, for one thing, is that maybe this child is still in a state of protection. And so, with the specific question that Kristan brought to me for today's Work Through It Wednesday, that was one of the first things that came to my mind, as well as some other things that we'll discuss later. But that's some foundational piece of what I do and look for.
Yeah, and that's fantastic because I think people need that foundational knowledge because this week's question was submitted by an early intervention occupational therapist, and that's why I thought it would be a great idea to bring Mandy on. So specifically, Melissa, an OT, she wrote to us and said, I'm an EI OT, it's early intervention, have several 2-year-olds with ASD, that's autism spectrum disorder, who constantly have items in their hands and other than tapping them together or mouthing them, they do no other action. We have tried reflex integration, brushing, sensory input, alternate oral inputs, and texture play, but nothing overrides this. They have low tone. They seldom just sit there. They seldom just sit still. They're always on the go. They're laying or propping themselves. They love deep pressure inputs, but are aversive to texture play. So for those of you who don't know, that's texture with, it could be slimy textures or crunchy textures or rough textures. And she says, we just feel like we've exhausted so much with this, but they've just seen some small gains. So they're looking for fresh perspective and ideas for treatment sessions. Thanks for the consideration. So thank you, Melissa, for submitting this for our Work Through It Wednesday. What I want to start out, Mandy, doing is really walking people through that sheet again. So if you have subscribed to our email list, you have that 4-quadrant sheet where it has attention, escape avoidant, gain tangible, and self-stimulatory. So like we do every week, what you're going to do is write in the attention column that no attention was given. And then in that escape avoidance column, you're going to write demand was presented. And then in gain tangible, it's pretty self-explanatory that the person completed that action to get a toy or a food or just some item from someone else. And self-stimulatory, we talk about, that's really going to be the category that we're looking at today, is to see how these children are doing these things to regulate their behavior. We talk about having too much or too little energy, or that they're just trying to get regulated. And so everything that you just wrote on that sheet, no attention was given, demand was presented, gain tangible in food, and too much or too little energy in that self-stimulatory category, that self-regulation, you're going to circle all that and then circle everything at the bottom, too much or too little, food, oxygen, water, sleep, activity, pain, and temperature, because that is all how we map out the antecedent process in that ABC chart that you have on that second page. So really, Mandy, as we go through this, the behavior here is pretty easy to define based on what Melissa submitted. The real issue is that they're constantly holding items in their hands. And so let's write that in the middle column, holding items in hands. So from a behavior perspective, I'm going to start to map that out. And as you kind of work through, where does your mind go when you first go through a scenario like this one as an OT?
Oh, well, that is like, if we could have scripted this, I couldn't have had you ask me a better question, because that's really the foundational piece, in my opinion. Because I love the sheets that you use, with our clients that we train, and also, the clients we work with individually. But I think it's really critical to ask some important questions first. Now, as an occupational therapist, my mind always goes to function. And, what function is this serving? And, like I said, I've been in the field over 20 years now, and things have changed. Things have changed a lot in that time. And back in the day, in my early years as an OT, it wasn't uncommon for us to hear this, a scenario like this, or many others, where maybe a little bit of an atypical behavior that you wouldn't typically see. And so we would automatically think, well, we need to come in and modify that behavior, because that's just maybe not what is socially the norm. To see in the therapy world a huge shift in this. And so where my mind goes first is, if the behavior is that a child is holding something in his hands, let's ask ourselves, what function is this serving for the child? And maybe more importantly, in this specific case, what function is this impeding? That's the root here. Because as an OT, if this is not impeding function, then do we need to intervene? That's the first question that I ask. And when I work with families individually, always that's what I'm going to come to is, why is this important to you as a parent? Why is it important to your child? And what is the reason behind us wanting to intervene here? Now, in this case, a child's holding something in their hand. If they're just doing that, maybe while they're watching their favorite show, or walking through the home or the daycare setting or whatever, I don't know that that's really limiting or impeding function in any way. I don't know. I haven't had the chance to talk to Melissa directly. Now, one place where maybe we would say, let's work through this sheet, because maybe this would be limiting, is say the child needs to feed himself at the table. And when he comes to the table, he's really unable to let go of those items. And that's resulting in, at age 2, Melissa said, a caregiver needing to do passive feeding of the child. Now, at 2 years old, we would expect the child to be able to feed himself with his fingers, and even beginning to use somewhat, with a spoon and a fork, at least exploring utensils, holding a sippy cup, and that kind of thing. If holding these items in his hand is limiting his participation in other functional activities, then we might say, let's think of a way that we could meet his needs for something in his hands or whatever that behavior is communicating to us, but also allow him to participate functionally in a task like feeding. So that makes sense.
Yeah, because in behaviorism, that's really a replacement behavior. And we call it stimulus pairing. So it's something that is more appropriate, that meets that need, but doesn't impair function. And so in behaviorism, we call it stimulus pairing. How can we help you meet that need, but in a different way that doesn't impair what you're trying to do? So then I guess really looking at the antecedent, as an OT, what would you say the antecedent is? Because I see that, because you and I have done trainings together, and we talk about kind of these trauma responses or something that happened early on in life that caused the absent or the unintegrated reflex. So helping people dig deeper into what might an antecedent be, as we're talking about, we teach trainings about the 8 sensory systems, but help us dig a little bit deeper into what that antecedent might be if it's truly impeding function and this kiddo is carrying these things around all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I have, forgive me for looking into the distance, I have Melissa's email to you right behind me. So I'm going to refer to that because I want to make sure I really stay on with what she asked us here. So some things that jump out to me as an antecedent, or what could be kind of underneath what's driving this need, as far as like you had mentioned, like a trauma type response, or is there something going on that the child is holding this? Some things that jumped out at me that she said is they are low tone. And for those of you who aren't in the therapy world, that means low muscle tone. It just means looseness around the joints, where a child doesn't have muscle tone is what helps us stay upright against gravity. It's different than muscle strength, but in therapy world, that would be a clue for me. Low muscle tone, always on the go. Kids with low muscle tone usually are always on the go, because we often think that sitting still is easier, but it's not. From a muscle perspective, moving is much easier. To sit and maintain a posture is tough. And so when little ones have low tone, they compensate. And so they keep moving. So they don't have to hold a static posture. Love deep pressure inputs, and aversive to texture play. So those are 2 big sensory keys that we talk about in our trainings. Loving deep pressure, you're really looking into that proprioceptive system. And aversive to texture play, that would be that tactile sensory system that we train on a lot. And so whenever you have a response that is too much or too little to sensory input, that's a clue to you that something's going on in the neurology of that child, in that sensory feedback loop, that he is not experiencing the sensory input in a way that would be considered typical. And so what's that going to impair? The motor output. Sensory input is interpreted and it produces a motor output. And so that's always an ongoing loop, just like, we're training all the time with people, but that's a big clue for me that something's going on for this little one that we might need to look a little more deeply.
Okay. Now, the one thing that she had talked about in her note too is that, they've done a lot of reflex work. Now, when you hear some of these things that she talked about, what are some of because I know that when we started having conversations about sensory integration and all of the reflexes, MNRI goes a lot deeper, and there's a lot more reflexes to this. So talk about some of what, I guess, basic sensory integration, the difference that MNRI has. Because when you and I had kind of talked about this question and going through, you and I had talked about some hands grasp reflex and things like that. So talk a little bit about the difference between like some basic primitive reflexes and, I guess, more advanced training that MNRI, some other resources we might be able to provide for people too, to look a little bit deeper.
Sure. Well, first off, I really want to applaud Melissa for, it looks like she's done some really great digging. When you get get into looking at reflexes, at sensory, and she mentioned a couple different things, the brushing and different tactile inputs. Good for you. That's great. Now, not having talked to her directly, again, I don't know specifically what her reflex background is. I do know, like you said, MNRI really takes a deep look at many primitive reflexes with a very specific protocol of testing, integration, and working through this process. I have heard other reflexes talk about, a hands grasp reflex, which is ones that I would definitely look at. I'm not sure, again, what exactly Melissa has used. That would be something I would look at through the MNRI lens. Another reflex that we use in MNRI is called Babkin. So hands grasp reflex, every reflex has a sensory stimulus, and much like sensory integration, it is interpreted neurologically, and it has a motor output. Hands grasp is a reflex that when you grasp, or when you provide sensory stimulus to the upper palm of the hand below the fingers, in an infant, they're going to grasp around your hand, around your finger. And many of us have seen this, if you're a parent, you've seen it in your own infant in those early weeks and months. Now, as the child, gets some more developed and refined hand skills, that doesn't stay automatic. It doesn't stay reflexive. They're able to override that and open and close their hand at will. Another one that I mentioned, though, that we look at in MNRI is called Babkin, or Babkin palmamental. And that stimulus is more in the center of the palm. And really interesting thing about this one, specifically with what Melissa talked to us about, is she mentioned other than mouthing, the child does mouthing of the toys in the hand. And Babkin is a reflex that is stimulated in the palm, and the response is an oral response. It's the mouth opening. And so you see that actively from about birth to about 4 months in a little one. And so, again, having not seen the kids, have not talked to Melissa, I'm kind of just using some educated guesses here of where I would go looking at this. But those are two big red flags, because when you see a lack of integration in those things, whether the reflex has never been active and integrated appropriately, or it's just still active and it hasn't become foundational, you see the things that she's talking about, maybe some delay in fine motor skills, or this tendency to just grasp on and not be able to move past something with the hands grasp. With Babkin, you see, a lot of mouthing, the oral overflow, and that type of behavior. In older kids, sometimes you'll even see that. That's a big one for the kids who, when they cut, have that related mouth movement we see so often. So, this has been eye-opening in my professional journey to really be able to look at a surface behavior and look at what's foundationally underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I think really, as you and I are working through this, I think that, behaviorists aren't trained as OTs, right? But I really think that one of the antecedents that's missing is like a physiological component, right? There's so much that happens. It can be, we talk about trauma-informed approaches during our trainings. We talk about how trauma is not just typical trauma, the way that people think about it, of verbal or physical abuse. It could be the way that you were born, or that you had a surgery, or that you took medication. The body holds trauma in different ways. It experiences trauma in different ways that are atypical. And so I think that's a big component that's why I love working together, is because there's other antecedents to this, right? It's not just always at face value that it's a behavioral issue. There are some underlying medical issues and physiological issues that are definitely happening with these kiddos. And so we have this antecedent that there was, their birth experience, something happened within their development. Then they're holding items in their hands, right? And the consequence is, what would you say is the consequence? It's regulating. You talked a little bit about proprioceptive and tactile input, right? So they're definitely getting regulated in that way, would you say?
It sounds like maybe even orally. She mentioned that they mouth the items in their hands. And so that can be, if in that sensory integration loop, when information comes in, if it's not interpreted as enough, then those are the kids that you hear and are labeled sensory seekers. And so they're constantly wanting more or deeper input. If the information is aversive, if it's too much, those are going to be sensory avoiders. And so with this little one, I could see both ends of the spectrum here, honestly, Kristan, because if he's a sensory seeker and he's needing more oral input to regulate himself, and he's holding these toys and bringing them to his mouth, and say his Babkin isn't integrated, that would be made perfect sense. However, the OT mentioned that this child is sensory sensitive. He's aversive to tactile input. And so what that tells me is he's a sensory avoider. And so what do we not do? You know, when I'm holding on to my pen like this, what else touches my palm? Nothing. Nothing.
Right.
It's a perfect way to avoid any other input that might be uncomfortable. And so these little ones never cease to amaze me. They're brilliant to get their little needs met. We have to be good investigators. And that's where I love your approach as a behaviorist, and really looking at all this thoroughly. It's a great skill to have.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, the first resources, you know, we're talking to OTs, but other practitioners to help know when to spot these things and refer to an OT that has this kind of experience. You know, the first kind of few resources that I would like to introduce to other OTs if they're not familiar is MNRI, the muscatovaMethod.com website. It's MASGUTOVA method.com is where you're getting your training through the MNRI. The other is that Visual Spatial Portals book. It's Visual Spatial Portals to Thinking, Feeling, and Movement. And I really learned about this at my time as a vision therapist, and talking about how vision therapy and developmental optometrists, which is something else we bring up in our training, it's the way that they look at retained primitive reflexes and how they address them during their therapy. So specifically, do you have any other resources to share, or any next steps you would have for Melissa in trying to assess for Babkin, or just simple ways to help integrate a Babkin?
Well, for Babkin, you know, what you would look for, the blatant thing that you would look for would be with, you know, pressing into that middle of the palm. If you see an obvious mouth open, there you go. It doesn't usually look that simple. It's not usually that cut and dry. And so sometimes you have to look at the effects of non-integration and just offer the treatment that you would as though it were that obvious. You know, hands grasp is a little bit more obvious. You can ask the child to make a fist. If their thumb doesn't come across the front in their fist, then you know, probably don't have an integrated hands grasp reflex. Another thing I saw with a little child today, I'll show you, is he was holding his cup. And my water bottle is large here, but he was holding his cup like this. I don't know if you can see my thumbs. And they were like this instead of like this. And it was a cup, and it was age appropriate and size appropriate for him, such that he should have been able to open his thumb and hold like that. But when he grasped it like this, I was like, oh gee, there's hands grasp. So that was my clue that that's what we needed to work on. So that's some simple clues for those two. And so when you look at integration, then again, I can't really get into all the specifics of the MNRI training. It's very detailed, very thorough. But one thing that is always great is just doing some general weight bearing, closing and opening of the hand. You know, if you can get on the floor and do crawling, wheelbarrow, you know, animal walks, those kind of things. Another thing specific to Babkin, though, is closing and opening your hand and really being able to fully open that palm and then to close it and to open it against pressure. And I brought a little hair tie here just to show this, whether you could use a scrunchie, a hair scrunchie, or maybe Play-Doh if the child could tolerate it, wrap it around and open up like that. That really gives a lot of input through that Babkin. And what you will see when it's not integrated is this. I don't know if you can see my hand and my mouth. Or you'll see the other hand going like this. And that related movement. So those are just, you know, to look for.
Yeah, and I think those are such subtle clues, and for us to be able to look for those as early interventionists are just so eye-opening. I know as a behaviorist, my mind automatically thinks of things that I can do to turn that into fun play. So now, you know, a lot of our kids like dinosaurs, right? So you can put even like a little sock or something on our hand or a scrunchie and play dinosaurs, growl, like making your dinosaur growl louder than mine. And always, that's why I like to collaborate with Mandy, right? It's kind of like, then how can we use that child's preferences? Mandy and I always do that. These integration of the preferences, thinking about what the kid you're working with really, really loves. What will you get more vested interest? Because these are going to be hard exercises for them to do. And you really want to make sure that you're working within their zone of proximal development, right? But what's going to get more buy-in? What are you going to get that's going to really keep them there for longer? And I think really being creative and fun about these ideas is the best way to do it. So
For sure.
yeah, any final thoughts about this, Mandy?
I think the only other thing I was going to offer is just, again, looking at the sensory piece. I look at always sensory and reflexes together, but, looking at that proprioceptive and the tactile sensory piece specifically, and how can you address those, and even, getting it specifically into the hands. And it would be similar activities, just that heavy work and weight through the hands. And then as well as some oral things, some way you can do some input orally. We talk about again in our trainings is how do we increase, if someone is as an oral sensory seeker, we look at taste, texture, and temperature. And so with taste, many times these are kids that like those spicy Doritos or barbecue sauce to dip. That's a higher alerting taste. A texture would be something really chewy. Kids will oftentimes gravitate towards fruit snacks or those fruit roll up things that are really, really chewy, hard and crunchy, again, like a Dorito or a hard cracker that really gives them a lot of crunch. And then temperature, obviously we wouldn't go hot, but using temperature to increase would be like freezing something. Maybe a child who would eat applesauce, maybe you can freeze the applesauce cup and it becomes kind of like a slushy or something like that. So those are just some quick go-tos, again, without the specifics of this particular child, that come to mind.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, again, today, just to recap, we talked about Melissa and OT. She submitted her question about a child that she's working with autism spectrum disorder. She has a lot of 2-year-olds on her caseload that are holding objects that are impeding the daily functions of their lives. And we talked about different ways to recognize these things called retained primitive reflexes, how to identify those, how to address those during the session, and additional resources that you can obtain if you're an occupational therapist or if you're just curious. The book that we talked about, The Visual Spatial Portals to Thinking, Feeling, and Movement, it's really geared more towards professionals, but can definitely be found on Amazon. And then you can always check out that muscatobenmethod.com website as well. So thank you again, Mandy, for joining us right here on another Work Through It Wednesday.
Yeah, and I thought I'm going to just add real quick here, and
Yeah.
I know that we train a lot of professionals, and absolutely, the Muscatova training is wonderful for PTs, OT, speech, any discipline. But we do have parents in our trainings in that too. So you don't have to be a licensed professional. If you want to learn more about this for your child, there's many parents I've been with alongside them in classes too. So just wanted to throw that out for everyone in our audience.
Yes, that is true. That is true. We want to have resources that are available and accessible to everyone. So it was great to mention that too. So, well, we will be right back. Well, I will. Maybe you might join me, depending on our question, right? But we welcome you to join us every Wednesday, 7 p.m., Work Through It Wednesday. If you don't already, you can subscribe to our email newsletter, and you can download the Functions of Behavior worksheet and the ABC chart. And again, even though these scenarios might not apply directly to you, just joining us and working through these scenarios with us will help you gain practice, so that if you're an independent early intervention contractor or you're working in a daycare or a school setting, practice makes perfect. So we want you to join us here, and hopefully we can support you in the future. If you have any questions, we welcome them. You can email them to me at behaviorworxpa@gmail.com. That's behaviorworxpa@gmail.com. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here next week. Take care.